I woke up at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning to a silence that didn't feel right. It wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that presses against your chest. Like something had already happened and the world hadn't caught up yet. Kevin wasn't beside me. His side of the bed was cold, too cold for someone who had just gotten up. I sat there for a second, listening. No footsteps. No running water. Nothing. Then I saw it, headlights sliding past our bedroom window, cutting through the darkness before disappearing down the driveway. Kevin, I don't know why I got up. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the part of me that had been quietly collecting all the things that didn't make sense lately. The late nights, the silence, the distance, whatever it was. It didn't let me stay in that bed. I grabbed my keys without turning on the lights and followed him. His truck was easy to spot on the empty road. A pair of red taillights drifting through the darkness like something I wasn't supposed to see. I kept my distance, my hands tight on the steering wheel, my heart beating louder than the engine. We drove farther than I expected, past the edge of town, past the last gas station, into the mountain road where the streetlights stopped and the trees closed in. And then he pulled over. I slowed, cutting my headlights before I got too close. My car rolled to a stop behind a cluster of rocks, just far enough that I could still see him without being seen. Kevin stepped out of the truck and walked to the back. For a moment, he just stood there, like he was thinking, like he was deciding something. Then he opened the trunk. I watched him reach inside and pull out a box. It was bigger than I expected. Heavy. I could tell from the way his body shifted, the way he struggled to drag it out. He didn't carry it. He dragged it. The sound of it scraping against the gravel cut through the silence. Sharp and wrong. I remember holding my breath, my fingers digging into the edge of the steering wheel as I watched him pull it closer to the edge of the cliff. There was no hesitation. He pushed it over. The box disappeared into the darkness. And a second later, there was a distant, hollow crash that echoed up from below. And I swear, just before it went over, I heard something. A faint sound. Not the wind. Not the gravel. Something from inside. That's when I grabbed my phone and called 911. I don't remember exactly what I said. My voice was shaking, words coming out in pieces. But I remember repeating the same thing over and over. He threw something down there. Something's not right. Please send someone. When I hung up, I stayed frozen in the car, barely breathing. Kevin didn't move right away. He stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down, his back to me. For a second, it felt like he knew I was there. Like if he turned around, everything would end right then. But he didn't. After a moment, he turned, walked back to the truck, and drove away like nothing had happened. I didn't follow him this time. I stayed exactly where I was, staring at the empty road, my hands still shaking, my chest tight. The night felt different now, heavier. Whatever was in that box, it wasn't just something he wanted to get rid of. It was something he needed to hide. And deep down, before the sirens even reached me, before the police lights cut through the darkness, before anyone opened that box, I already knew. My life wasn't going back to what it was before that night. Not after what I had just seen. Not after what I thought I heard. I sat in my car long after the call ended. My phone still pressed against my ear like it could hold me together. The darkness outside hadn't changed. But everything inside me had. My hands were trembling. My breath uneven. And no matter how many times I blinked, I couldn't unsee the moment that box disappeared into the cliff. For a split second, I tried to convince myself I was wrong. Maybe it wasn't what I thought. Maybe it was something harmless. Trash. Equipment. Anything but what my mind was telling me. But deep down, I knew better. Sirens began to echo in the distance, growing louder, cutting through the silence. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the sound ground me. Help was coming. Someone else would see what I saw. Someone else would make sense of it. Because I couldn't. And as I sat there waiting, something shifted inside me. Not panic. Not yet. Something colder. Because the truth was, This didn't start tonight. It started long before I ever got in that car. I used to believe my life was simple. I was 35, a second-grade teacher in a small Colorado town where everyone knew everyone. My days were predictable in the best way. Early mornings, lesson plans spread across the kitchen table. The smell of coffee filling the house before the sun even came up. My students depended on me. They trusted me. And I liked being the kind of person who never let anyone down. Stability mattered to me. Routine mattered. Maybe that's why I held on so tightly to my marriage, even when it started slipping. Kevin had always been the opposite of me. He was energy, movement, passion, a chef who could turn a simple meal into something unforgettable. People loved him. He had that kind of presence, effortless, magnetic, the kind of man who could walk into a room and make everyone feel like they mattered. That's how he made me feel in the beginning. We met at his restaurant, a place that quickly became the heart of the town. I remember the first time he spoke to me, leaning casually against the counter, smiling like he already knew me. It felt easy, natural, like we had always been meant to find each other. Our relationship moved fast, maybe too fast. But back then, it didn't feel like a mistake. It felt like certainty. We built a life together that looked perfect from the outside. Weekend dinners, shared laughter, quiet nights at home. People would tell me how lucky I was, how rare it was to find someone like Kevin. And I believed them. I believed everything. Until the small things started changing. At first, it was subtle. He stayed late at the restaurant more often, said he was working on new menus, dealing with staff issues, handling deliveries. It made sense. I didn't question it. Then he stopped talking as much. Not all at once. Just little things. Fewer details about his day. Shorter answers. Moments where I could feel his attention somewhere else. Even when he was sitting right in front of me. I told myself it was stress. That's what people do when they don't want to see what's really happening. They explain things away. Then came the distance. The way he stopped reaching for me without thinking. The way his touch became deliberate instead of natural. The way conversations felt like something we had to maintain. Not something that just happened. And still, I said nothing. Because saying it out loud would make it real. I remember the first time I noticed the smell. It was faint. Not strong enough to be obvious. But it wasn't mine. I stood there in the hallway, his jacket in my hands, breathing in that unfamiliar scent, my heart sinking in a way I didn't want to understand. I could have asked him right then. I could have confronted him. But I didn't. I hung the jacket back up, walked away, and pretended it didn't matter. Because pretending was easier than knowing. There was one moment, though, that stayed with me. A few weeks before everything changed. I saw his phone light up while he was in the shower. I wasn't trying to look. I didn't even want to, but it was right there. A message. No name. Just a number. And a single line of text. Short. Personal. Too personal. I didn't open it. I didn't scroll. I didn't do anything that would cross that line. I just turned the screen off and walked away like I hadn't seen it. Like I didn't already feel something breaking inside me. Looking back now, that was the moment I should have listened to myself. Because everything that followed, it wasn't sudden. It was building. Every late night. Every unanswered question. Every time I chose silence over truth. It all led here. To me, sitting alone in my car in the middle of the night. Waiting for the police to arrive after watching my husband throw something into a cliff. The man I had trusted with my entire life. The man I had defended. Believed in, stood beside even when things didn't feel right. And now, I couldn't even recognize him anymore. The sirens grew louder. Closer now. Flashing lights beginning to reflect off the trees ahead. I straightened in my seat. My grip tightening again. My mind racing in a different way this time. Because this wasn't just about a secret anymore. This wasn't just about another woman. Or late nights. Or things I could explain away. This was something else. Something darker. And for the first time since I married Kevin, I realized something that should have terrified me more than anything else. I didn't know who my husband really was. Not even a little. And whatever I had just witnessed was only the beginning. The sirens reached me before I was ready for them. Red and blue lights tore through the darkness, bouncing off the trees, cutting across the cliffside like something out of a nightmare. I stepped out of the car on unsteady legs, the cold mountain air hitting my face, sharp and real, but not enough to wake me from what felt like a dream I couldn't escape. An officer approached me immediately, his voice calm but firm, asking if I was the one who made the call. I nodded, my words coming out broken, uneven. I saw him. He stopped here. He had a box. He threw it over. The officer's expression didn't change much, but I saw it in his eyes, that flicker of doubt. It made sense. What I was saying didn't sound real. It didn't even sound real to me. But another officer moved closer to the edge, shining a flashlight down into the darkness below. How far down? Someone asked. I don't know, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I heard it hit. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the trees, carrying a hollow echo from below that made my chest tighten. They called for additional units. Rescue. Equipment. Everything started moving faster after that. More vehicles arrived. More lights. Voices overlapping. Radios crackling. The quiet, empty road transformed into something alive. Urgent. Controlled chaos replacing the stillness. I stood back as they secured the area, my arms wrapped around myself, watching as ropes and harnesses were prepared. One of the officers told me to stay behind the line, but I couldn't stop staring at the edge. It felt like if I looked away, something would change, like the truth would disappear with it. Time stretched. Minutes felt like hours as the rescue team began lowering someone down the cliff. Their movements were careful, deliberate, every step measured. A flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness, swallowed whole. I held my breath without realizing it. What if I was wrong? What if there was nothing down there? What if I had just imagined everything? But then a voice came through the radio. We've got something. My heart dropped. The words echoed in my head, louder than anything else around me. They found it. I took a step forward before someone gently stopped me, a hand on my arm, guiding me back. Ma'am, please stay here. I nodded, but I couldn't feel my legs anymore. My body felt disconnected, like I was watching everything happen from somewhere outside myself. The team worked carefully, slowly lifting something up from below. It took more than one person. Whatever it was heavy. When it finally came into view, my stomach twisted. The box. It was cracked along one side, dirt and debris clinging to it. The edges splintered from the impact. But it was still mostly intact, still closed. They set it down on the ground a few feet away from me. And for a second, everything went completely silent. No radios, no voices, just the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven in my ears. I noticed the surface of the box first. Scratches, not from the fall, from something inside. My throat tightened. One of the officers knelt down, carefully examining it, while another brought over tools. They spoke quietly, words I couldn't fully hear, but I understood enough. They were going to open it. I wanted to look away. I couldn't. The first crack of the lid breaking open made me flinch. The sound was sharp, final, like something irreversible had just happened. They pulled the top back slowly, and then everything inside me shattered. It was my father. His face was pale, bruised, barely recognizable at first. There were marks on his wrists, deep, angry lines like he had been restrained. His clothes were torn, his body limp, but he was breathing. He's alive, someone shouted. The world rushed back all at once. Paramedics moved in immediately, checking his pulse, his breathing, calling out instructions. Oxygen mask, stretcher. Urgency filled the air. I stumbled forward, my voice breaking. Dad, can you hear me? There was no response. His eyes fluttered slightly, but they didn't focus, didn't see me. They didn't know me. I dropped to my knees beside him, my hands shaking as I reached for him. But someone gently pulled me back. "We've got him," a paramedic said firmly. "We need space." I nodded. Even though I didn't want to move, I didn't want to let go. They lifted him onto the stretcher quickly, securing him, moving with practiced precision. Everything was happening so fast, but it still felt too slow. Too slow to make sense of it. Too slow to stop the thought forming in my head. He was in that box. My father? And Kevin was the one who put it there. I felt it before I saw him. A shift in the air. A presence I couldn't ignore. I turned. Kevin was walking toward us, his expression tight, confused, like he had just arrived at something he didn't understand. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice controlled but sharp. "Emily, what happened?" For a second, I just stared at him, really looked at him, at the man I had loved, trusted, built a life with. He looked the same, but nothing about him felt familiar anymore. "They found someone," I said carefully, my voice steady in a way I didn't recognize. "Down there." He glanced toward the stretcher, his eyes narrowing slightly as the paramedics rushed my father toward the ambulance. "Who is it?" he asked. I watched him as I answered. "My father." Something flickered across his face. It was quick, almost invisible, but I saw it. And in that moment, I knew. He wasn't surprised. Not really. The officers began asking questions again, this time with more urgency. Kevin answered calmly, smoothly, his tone measured. Cooperative, the perfect husband, the perfect man. But I wasn't listening to his words anymore. I was watching him. Every movement, every expression. And for the first time, I wasn't trying to understand him. I was trying to see through him. As the ambulance doors slammed shut and the sirens started again, I felt something settle deep inside me. Something cold. Something certain. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't a mistake. Whatever Kevin was hiding, it wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a crime. The hospital lights were too bright. Everything felt too clean, too controlled. Like the chaos from the cliff had been sealed outside those walls. I sat in a plastic chair, my hands still trembling in my lap, staring at the closed doors where they had taken my father. Alive. That word kept echoing in my mind. Alive, but barely. A nurse had told me he was stable for now, that the doctors were doing everything they could. But her voice had that careful tone, the one people use when they don't want to promise anything. I nodded when she spoke, but I barely heard her. All I could see was that box, and him inside it. After what felt like hours, a doctor finally came out, middle-aged, tired eyes, calm voice. "He's going to make it through the night," he said. "But he's suffered significant trauma." My chest tightened. What kind of trauma? Blunt force injuries? Dehydration? And he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Signs that he may have been restrained for some time. Restrained. The word landed hard. So, he wasn't just. I couldn't finish the sentence. The doctor met my eyes. His injuries aren't consistent with a single fall alone. That was all I needed. Whatever happened to my father didn't start at that cliff. It ended there. I sat back down, my mind racing, trying to put the pieces together, but they refused to form anything clear. Just fragments. Questions. Fear. Footsteps approached from the hallway. I didn't have to look up to know it was Kevin. Emily. His voice was softer now. Controlled. Concerned. I looked at him slowly. He stood there like he belonged. Like this was just another difficult night we were facing together. "How is he?" he asked. "They say he'll live," I replied. Relief crossed his face. But something about it felt delayed. Like it had to catch up to the moment. "That's good," he said quietly. "That's really good." I watched him as he spoke. Every word. Every breath. "You must be terrified," he added, stepping closer. "I can't imagine what you're going through." But I could, and for the first time, I wasn't sure he could. I'm okay, I said. Even though it wasn't true. He studied me for a second, like he was trying to read something behind my words. Do you know what happened? He asked. The question hung in the air between us. I could have told him. I could have said everything right there, what I saw, what I heard, what I knew, but I didn't. No, I said instead. They're still trying to figure it out. He nodded slowly, accepting the answer too easily. Let the police handle it, he said. That's what they're there for. It sounded reasonable. It sounded supportive. But something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. Not comfort. Control. I didn't respond. A pair of officers approached us, their presence shifting the energy immediately. Ma'am, we'd like to ask you a few more questions, one of them said. I nodded. Standing up. Kevin stayed where he was. I'll be right here, he said. I didn't look back at him as I followed the officers down the hall. They asked me to go over everything again. The drive. The cliff. The box. This time, I told them more. Not everything, but enough. I saw him, I said carefully. A man. He was there. Could you identify him? One officer asked. I hesitated. The truth sat right on the edge of my tongue. But I swallowed it. It was dark, I said. I couldn't see clearly. They exchanged a glance. Understood. The other officer said, writing something down. Circumstantial. That's what this was. Without proof. Without confirmation. It was just my word against nothing. And I knew that wasn't enough. When I returned to the waiting area, Kevin was sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked up as I approached, his expression tightening slightly. What did they ask? He said. Just what happened, I replied. And I told them what I saw. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary. Good, he said finally. The word felt wrong. Time passed slowly after that. Machines beeped faintly in the background. Nurses walked by. The world kept moving, but I felt stuck in place. Then, a nurse appeared again. He's waking up, she said. Everything inside me snapped to attention. I rushed down the hallway, Kevin following a step behind. My father lay in the hospital bed, pale, wires attached, eyes barely open. Dad, I whispered, stepping closer. It's me. It's Emily. His gaze shifted toward me, unfocused at first, then slightly clearer. For a moment, hope surged through me. He was here. He was alive. He could tell me what happened. Dad, can you hear me? I said, my voice shaking. Do you know what happened? Who did this to you? His brow furrowed. Confusion. He looked at me like he was trying to place me, like my face was something he should recognize but couldn't quite reach. His voice was weak, strained. I don't. The words fell apart. He shook his head slightly. I don't remember. The room felt like it tilted. What do you mean? I whispered. You don't remember anything. He blinked slowly, his eyes drifting, searching. No. The doctor stepped in gently. Memory loss is common with this kind of trauma, he explained. It may come back. Or it may not. May not. Those two words hit harder than anything else that night. The one person who could confirm the truth. The one person who could say what happened. Couldn't remember. I stepped back, my chest tight. The air suddenly too thin. Behind me, I felt Kevin's presence again. Silent. Watching. And for the first time since all of this started, something changed inside me. If my father couldn't remember the truth, then no one was going to hand it to me. I would have to find it myself. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see Kevin standing there across the room. And this time, when I looked at him, I didn't feel confusion. I didn't feel doubt. I felt something else. Fear. Because I finally understood something I should have seen much earlier. I wasn't just living with secrets. I was living with someone capable of creating them and hiding them. And for the first time, I stopped trusting my husband and started watching him. I didn't go home right away. I sat in the hospital parking lot long after Kevin went back inside, my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. My father was alive, but he couldn't remember. The police had questions, but no answers. And Kevin was still standing there, calm, controlled, untouched by everything that had just happened. That was the part I couldn't shake. If he had nothing to do with it, why did it feel like he already knew how this would play out? By the time I finally drove home, the sky was beginning to lighten at the edges. Morning was coming, but it didn't feel like a new day. It felt like something unfinished had followed me back. The house looked the same. Quiet. Still. Familiar. But the moment I stepped inside, it didn't feel like mine anymore. The air felt heavier. The silence louder. Every object in the room seemed to hold something I hadn't noticed before. I stood there for a moment, just listening. No footsteps. No voices. Kevin wasn't home yet. Good. I didn't give myself time to think about what I was about to do. If I did, I might stop. Instead, I walked straight into the bedroom and opened his closet. My hands hesitated for a second, hovering over his things. This was a line I had never crossed. But that was before tonight. I started small. Pockets, jackets, drawers. At first, it was nothing. Receipts, old notes, random items that didn't mean anything on their own. Then I found something that didn't fit. A folded receipt tucked deep inside a jacket he rarely wore. I opened it slowly. A payment. Large. Much larger than anything casual. Not for groceries. Not for supplies. For something else. Something I didn't recognize. I frowned, setting it aside, and kept going. Another receipt. Another payment. Same pattern. Different dates. All spaced out over the past few months. My chest tightened. This wasn't random. This was consistent. Deliberate. I moved to the dresser, opening the bottom drawer. That's where I found the phone. It wasn't his usual one. Smaller. Older. Hidden beneath a stack of folded clothes. My heart started pounding again. I picked it up carefully, like it might explode in my hands. It wasn't locked. That was the first mistake he made. The screen lit up, and I saw messages immediately. A name. Hannah. My stomach dropped. I opened the thread. The messages weren't long, but they were enough. Too familiar. Too personal. Not just conversations. Plans. Arguments. Silence. And then, nothing. The last message was weeks ago. I scrolled back, my breath catching in my throat. Photos. Her, a woman in her early 30s, smiling at the camera, unaware of everything that would come after. Hannah. I stared at her face longer than I should have. This wasn't just a suspicion anymore. This was real. Kevin wasn't just distant. He was living a second life. My fingers tightened around the phone. I should have felt rage. Maybe I did. But it wasn't the strongest emotion. It was something else. Something colder. Because this didn't explain the cliff. It didn't explain my father. And it definitely didn't explain the box. I kept scrolling. That's when I saw it. A message that didn't match the others. Short. Sharp. Different tone. We need to fix this before it gets worse. No response after that. Just silence. I leaned back slowly, my mind racing. Fix what? And why did it sound like a threat? I set the phone down and grabbed my own, searching her name. It didn't take long. Hannah Carter. 32. Accountant. Local. Her social media profile appeared almost instantly. Photos. Friends. A life that looked normal. Until it stopped. Her last post was over a month ago. Nothing after that. No updates. No comments. No sign she was still active. It was like she had just disappeared. A chill ran through me. People don't just vanish like that. Not without a reason. I went back to the messages, back to the photos, and then I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A picture of her standing in front of a mirror, her hand resting on her stomach. Subtle, but unmistakable. She was pregnant. I froze. My heart started racing again. Faster this time. Pregnant. The word echoed in my head, louder with every second. I scrolled further, looking for anything that confirmed it. Doctor appointments, conversations, hints. And then I found it. A message from Kevin. Don't tell anyone yet. We'll figure it out. My grip tightened. There was no mention of the baby anywhere else. No announcement. No update. Nothing. Which meant one thing. The child existed. But no one knew. I dropped the phone onto the bed, my thoughts spinning out of control. An affair? A pregnancy? A woman who had suddenly disappeared. My father, found beaten and thrown into a cliff. And Kevin, right in the center of all of it. This wasn't just betrayal. This was something much bigger. Something I hadn't even begun to understand. I turned slowly, scanning the room again, seeing it differently now. Not as a home, but as a place full of answers I hadn't found yet. And questions I wasn't ready to ask out loud. I picked the phone back up, staring at Hannah's name one more time. I didn't know what had happened to her. I didn't know where she was. But I knew one thing. She wasn't just the other woman. She was connected to everything. And whatever Kevin had done, it didn't end with her. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening as the realization settled in. If she disappeared, and my father was almost killed, then Kevin wasn't just hiding an affair. He was hiding consequences. I didn't sleep. By the time the sun came up, I was still sitting on the edge of the bed. Hannah's messages burned into my mind like something I couldn't erase. Every piece of it kept looping, her face, the silence, the pregnancy, the baby. That was the part I couldn't let go of. If she had been pregnant, where was the child now? Kevin moved around the house later that morning like nothing had changed. Coffee brewing, cabinet doors opening and closing. The same routine he had followed for years. I watched him from across the room, studying every movement, every glance, every pause. He didn't know. Not about the phone. Not about what I had seen. And for the first time, that gave me something. An advantage. You're quiet, he said casually, leaning against the counter. I didn't sleep, I replied, keeping my voice even. Yeah, he nodded. Last night was a lot. A lot. That was his word for it. I said nothing. He picked up his phone, scrolling through it quickly, his thumb moving faster than usual. Then he turned slightly away from me, just enough to shield the screen, deleting something. My chest tightened, but I kept my face neutral. Are you going back to the hospital later? He asked. I will, I said. He nodded again. Like everything made sense. Like everything was normal. It wasn't, and he knew it. We both did. The silence stretched between us, heavier now, filled with things neither of us was saying. Then the doorbell rang. The sound cut through the air, sharp and unexpected. Kevin froze for half a second. So did I. I'll get it, I said quickly. Before he could move, he hesitated, then nodded. I walked to the door slowly, my heart starting to pound again. Not from fear this time, but from something else. Instinct. When I opened it, a woman stood on the other side, holding a baby. She looked nervous, tired, like she hadn't slept either. Is Kevin here? She asked, her voice uncertain. I shook my head. He's not. Can I help you? She hesitated, her grip tightening slightly around the baby. I need to talk to him. What about... She glanced past me, like she was checking if he was inside anyway. Then her eyes returned to mine. You're his wife. Right. I nodded slowly. Her expression shifted, something between relief and fear. I can't keep doing this, she said quietly. My pulse spiked. Doing what? She looked down at the baby, then back at me. This, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Before I could react, she stepped forward and placed the baby into my arms. I froze. The weight of him, small, warm, real, settled against me in a way that made everything else disappear for a second. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice shaking. "He paid me," she said quickly. "Kevin, he paid me to take care of him for a few days." My heart dropped. "Take care of who?" She looked at me like I already knew the answer. "The baby," she said. "His baby." The words hit harder than anything I had read the night before. I looked down at the child in my arms. Tiny. Quiet. Completely unaware of everything surrounding him. "No," I whispered. "That's not—" "It is—" She cut in gently. "It's his—" and Hannah's— Hannah. The name echoed in my head. Louder now. Heavier. I felt like the ground beneath me shifted. "How do you know that?" I asked. She let out a breath, like she had been holding it in too long. "Because I was there," she said. "I helped her before everything went wrong." My fingers tightened instinctively around the baby. "What happened to her?" I asked. Her eyes flickered, uncertainty crossing her face. "I don't know exactly," she admitted. But she was scared. Really scared. She said Kevin was under pressure. That things were getting out of control. Pressure. The word stuck with me. "He told me to keep the baby," she continued. "Just for a few days. Said he'd come back for him." "And now?" I asked. She shook her head. "He hasn't answered my calls. I can't keep this going. I don't want to be involved in whatever this is." Whatever this is. That made two of us. I looked down at the baby again. His eyes were half closed. His breathing soft and steady, like the world around him didn't exist. But it did, and it was dangerous. "Please," she said quietly. "I don't know what's happening, but I know it's not normal. I can't be the one holding this anymore. Neither could I. But I already was—" "Did he say anything else?" I asked. She hesitated. "Just that he needed to fix things," she said. Fast. The same words. My chest tightened. "What does that mean?" I pressed. "I don't know," she said, shaking her head again. "And I don't want to find out." Silence settled between us. Then she reached into the diaper bag and handed it to me. "Everything he'll need is in there," she said. I took it automatically, my mind still trying to catch up with reality. "Are you going to tell him?" she asked carefully. I looked at her, then at the baby, then back at her. "No," I said. "Not yet." She nodded, like she understood. Then she turned and walked away without another word. I closed the door slowly, my hand still shaking, the baby still in my arms. The house felt different again. Heavier. Quieter. More dangerous. I walked into the living room and sat down, staring at the small life I was now holding. Kevin's secret. Not hidden anymore. Not gone. Right here. Breathing. Real. And for the first time since all of this started, something shifted inside me again. Not fear. Not confusion. Control. Because Kevin didn't know. He didn't know I had seen the messages. He didn't know I knew about Hannah. And now, he didn't know about this. I looked down at the baby, adjusting my hold carefully as he stirred slightly. "You're not the problem," I whispered softly. He blinked slowly, unaware. But I wasn't, and neither was he. Kevin thought he could bury everything. Hide it. Control it. But now one of his secrets was sitting in my arms. And he had no idea. The baby didn't cry much. That was the first thing I noticed as the morning stretched into afternoon. He moved quietly, breathed softly, like he had already learned not to make too much noise in a world that hadn't chosen him. I sat on the couch with him resting against my chest, one hand supporting his head, the other lightly tracing the edge of the blanket wrapped around him. It felt strange, wrong, even, to be holding the living proof of my husband's betrayal. And yet, I didn't feel anger when I looked at him. I felt responsibility. I felt something shift inside me that I hadn't expected. Because whatever Kevin had done, this child wasn't part of it. This child was the consequence. And somehow, that made him the most innocent part of everything. I exhaled slowly, my eyes drifting toward the bag the woman had left behind. I needed to understand more. Carefully, I adjusted the baby against a pillow and reached for it, opening it on the coffee table. Inside were the usual things: bottles, formula, extra clothes. But there were also things that didn't belong. A folded envelope, a small USB drive, and a receipt. My heart started beating faster. I picked up the envelope first, sliding my finger under the seal. Inside was a single piece of paper, a bank transfer confirmation. The amount made my stomach tighten. It wasn't small. It wasn't something you paid for babysitting. It was the kind of money that bought silence. I set it down slowly and picked up the receipt. Same pattern, different date. Same account number. That number again. The same one I had seen in Kevin's jacket. My chest tightened. This wasn't separate. This was connected. Every piece of it. I reached for the USB next, turning it over in my hand. It was small, simple, unmarked. But it didn't feel insignificant. Nothing about this felt insignificant anymore. I glanced back at the baby. Still quiet. Still unaware. Then I stood up, moving to the desk in the corner of the room where my laptop sat. My hands hesitated for a second before I plugged it in. For a moment, nothing happened. Then files appeared on the screen. Documents. Spreadsheets. Records. My breath caught. This wasn't random information. This was organized. Carefully. Deliberately. Transaction logs. Names I didn't recognize. Amounts that didn't make sense. And Kevin's name, buried in places he shouldn't be. My heart started racing as I scrolled. This wasn't just debt. This was something else. Something bigger. Something hidden. A network. The word formed in my mind before I could stop it. And suddenly, everything shifted again. My father. The look on his face the last time I saw him before the attack. The way he had paused mid-sentence, like he wanted to tell me something but couldn't. At the time, I thought it was nothing. Now, it wasn't. Now, it was everything. I leaned back slightly, staring at the screen. He had known, or at least, he had started to. That's why he was targeted. That's why he ended up in that box. My chest tightened, anger rising beneath the surface. Not loud, not explosive. Controlled. Focused. Because this wasn't random. It was intentional. Every piece of it. I closed the laptop slowly. My thoughts racing in a different way now. Not fear. Strategy. Because if Kevin was involved in something like this, then he wasn't alone. That realization settled heavily in my chest. Someone else knew. Someone else was part of it. And that made everything more dangerous. The front door opened. I froze. Kevin. His footsteps were steady as he walked in. Like any other day. Hey, he called out casually. I moved quickly, closing the laptop fully, sliding the USB back into the bag, making everything look untouched. Hey, I replied, my voice steady. He stepped into the living room, his eyes immediately scanning the space. Then he saw the baby, and for a split second, something broke. It was fast, almost invisible, but I saw it. What is that? He asked, his tone sharp. Controlled? I shifted slightly, adjusting the baby in my arms. A baby, I said calmly. His jaw tightened. Where did it come from? Someone dropped him off, I replied. Said you'd know why. Silence. Heavy. Loaded. His eyes locked onto mine. Searching. Calculating. Who? He asked. I shrugged slightly. She didn't give a name. That was a lie. And we both knew it. He took a step closer. Emily, he said, his voice lower now. This isn't funny. I'm not joking, I said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Another pause. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced down at it, his expression tightening. "I need to take this," he said quickly. "Of course you do." He stepped outside, the door closing behind him. I didn't move. I just listened. His voice was muffled through the door, but I could hear the tone. Urgent. Tense. Not calm anymore. Fragments slipped through. "Not now." "I told you I'm handling it. Just give me time." Time. That word again. My grip tightened slightly around the baby. He wasn't in control. Not completely. Someone else was pushing him, pressuring him. And that meant one thing. He was dangerous. But he wasn't the only danger. The door opened again, and Kevin stepped back inside, his expression carefully neutral again. But I saw through it now. All of it. I looked at him, not as my husband, but as a man standing between me and something much bigger. Something hidden. Something that had already hurt my father. Something that could still destroy everything. And for the first time, I didn't feel confused. I didn't feel uncertain. I understood. Kevin wasn't the end of this. He was just the beginning. And whatever he was connected to was far worse than I had imagined. I waited until Kevin left again before I made the call. The baby was asleep in the small bassinet I had pulled into the living room. His breathing soft, steady, almost fragile in a house that no longer felt safe. I stood by the window, watching Kevin's truck disappear down the street, my heart beating in a slow, controlled rhythm. Not fear. Not anymore. Focus. I went back to the table, picked up my phone, and stared at the name on the screen. Julia. I had seen it in the files, in the messages, in the places Kevin thought I would never look. If Hannah had trusted anyone, it was her. My thumb hovered over the call button for a second. Then I pressed it. It rang twice. 3 times. I almost hung up. "Hello?" Her voice was cautious, guarded. "Julia," I said. A pause. "Who is this?" "My name is Emily," I replied. "I'm Kevin's wife." Silence. Longer this time. Then her voice changed. "Why are you calling me?" "Because I'm holding a baby that shouldn't exist. Because my father was almost killed. Because your cousin disappeared. But I didn't say any of that. I need to talk to you about Hannah," I said instead. Another pause. "You shouldn't be calling me," she said quietly. "I know about the baby." That stopped her. I could hear it in the way her breath caught. "What baby?" she asked. But the denial came too quickly. "The one Kevin is trying to hide," I said. "The one Hannah had." Silence again. Then, softer this time. "Where are you?" We agreed to meet 20 minutes later. A small parking lot just outside town. Open enough to feel safe. Empty enough to avoid attention. I wrapped the baby carefully. My hands steady now. My movements deliberate. I didn't know what I would find when I got there. But I knew one thing. I wasn't walking into this blind anymore. The parking lot was nearly empty when I arrived. Just a few scattered cars. The late afternoon light casting long shadows across the pavement. I stayed in the car at first, watching. Then I saw her. She stepped out of a gray sedan, her posture tense, her eyes scanning the area before locking onto me. Julia. She looked younger than I expected, but tired, like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. I got out of the car slowly, holding the baby close. Her eyes dropped to him immediately, and everything changed. The moment she saw his face, her expression broke. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping closer without thinking. She didn't ask. She didn't need to. Her voice faltered. "He's really here." I nodded. Her hand hovered near him, hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch him. "Hannah," she said, barely audible. She was so scared. The words hit harder than I expected. "What happened to her?" I asked. Julia looked up at me, something sharp flickering in her eyes. "You don't know. If I knew, I wouldn't be here." She let out a breath, running a hand through her hair. "She was trying to leave him," Julia said finally. That's what you need to understand. This wasn't some affair she wanted to keep going. She was trying to get out. My chest tightened. Why? Julia laughed softly. But there was no humor in it. Because Kevin wasn't just cheating on you, she said. He was using her. The word lingered between us. Using her how? She found things, Julia said. Financial records. Transactions. Stuff that didn't make sense. She thought it was just debt at first, but it wasn't. My heart started racing again. She said he was involved in something. Julia continued. Something he couldn't get out of. And when she found out, she became a problem. A problem. The same word. Different context. What kind of problem? I asked. Julia shook her head. She didn't tell me everything. Just that if anyone found out, it would destroy him. And not just him. My grip tightened around the baby. She was going to expose him, Julia added quietly. That's why she was trying to leave. The pieces started locking into place. Hannah. The files. The money. My father. What happened the night she disappeared? I asked. Julia's expression shifted. She looked away. I don't know exactly, she said. You're lying. Her head snapped back toward me. I'm not lying, she said quickly. I don't know everything. What do you know? She hesitated, then sighed. She called me, Julia admitted. That night, said Kevin found out, that he knew she was going to leave. My pulse spiked. What did she say? She was scared, Julia said. Said if anything happened to her. It wasn't an accident. The words hung in the air like something final. And then, I pressed. Julia swallowed. And then she stopped answering. Silence settled between us. Heavy. Real. She didn't run, Julia said after a moment. That's what everyone thinks. But she didn't. She wouldn't have left him alone. The baby shifted slightly in my arms, a soft sound escaping him. Julia looked down at him again, her expression softening. She wanted to protect him, she whispered. That's all she cared about at the end. I felt something tighten in my chest. Because now I understood, this wasn't just about secrets. This was about survival. For Hannah, for the baby, and now for me. Julia looked back up at me, her eyes sharp again. If Kevin finds out you know this much, she said quietly, you won't get a second chance. I held her gaze. I'm not planning on giving him one. Another pause. Different this time. Not fear. Recognition. You're not what I expected, she said. Neither is he, I replied. She nodded slowly. For the first time since this started, I wasn't alone. But as I stood there, holding the child that connected all of this together, listening to the truth unravel piece by piece, I realized something else. The danger hadn't passed. It had just gotten closer. The house didn't feel like mine anymore. By the time I got back from meeting Julia, the sun had already started to set, and the shadows inside the house stretched longer than usual, creeping into corners that used to feel safe. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a second, listening. Silence. Too much of it. I carried the baby into the living room and set him gently into the bassinet. He stirred for a moment, then settled again, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythm that felt almost unreal compared to everything else. I checked the windows, the locks, the back door. Everything was closed. But it didn't matter, because the danger wasn't outside anymore. It was already here. I moved through the house carefully, gathering everything I had, documents, the USB, the phone I had found. I placed them in a folder, keeping it close, my mind running through every piece of information again. Hannah, the network, my father, and Kevin, somewhere in the middle of all of it. I didn't know exactly what I was dealing with yet, but I knew one thing. If he realized what I knew, I wouldn't get time to figure it out. I needed to be ready. The sound of tires on gravel outside froze me in place. Kevin. Too early. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay still, to breathe, You knew this was coming. I slid the folder into a drawer, closed it quietly, and stepped back into the living room just as the front door opened. Emily. His voice called out. Yeah, I answered, keeping my tone even. He walked in, his eyes scanning the room the same way they had earlier, sharp, searching. And then he saw the bassinet, the baby. His entire body went still. For just a second. Then it passed. What is that doing here? He asked, his voice lower now. I crossed my arms slightly, leaning against the edge of the couch. I told you. Someone brought him. His eyes flicked to mine. Who? She didn't give a name. Another lie. Another test. He took a step closer. Emily, he said, his tone tightening. This isn't something you just bring into the house. He's not something, I replied, my voice calm but firm. He's a child. Silence. Heavy. His jaw clenched. You need to tell me exactly what's going on, he said. I held his gaze. So do you? The words landed harder than I expected. For a second, something shifted in his expression. Not confusion. Recognition. He knew. Or at least he suspected. What do you mean? He asked. But there was an edge in his voice now. I mean, I said slowly, this isn't normal. Kevin, none of it is. His eyes narrowed slightly. You're acting strange, he said. I almost laughed. Am I? Yes, he snapped. You are. There it was. The crack. I watched you last night, I said quietly. The room went still. His face didn't change. But his eyes did. What are you talking about? He asked. I saw you. I continued. On the mountain road. The cliff. Silence. Longer this time. He stared at me like he was calculating something. Deciding. That's ridiculous, he said finally. I wasn't there. I took a step forward. Don't lie to me. His expression hardened. I'm not lying. Yes, you are. The tension snapped. You think you know what you saw, he said, his voice rising slightly. You think you can just accuse me of something like that? I'm not accusing you, I replied. I'm telling you what I saw. His breathing changed. Faster now. Less controlled. You're tired, he said. You're confused. Your father. Don't. I cut him off sharply. He froze. Don't use him to explain this, I said. The silence that followed was different. Not uncertain. Dangerous. He took another step toward me. Slow. Deliberate. You need to calm down, he said. His voice lower now. I didn't move. I am calm. No, he said. You're not. His hand reached out, not to comfort. To control. I stepped back instinctively. Stay away from me, I said. That's when something broke. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious. But it was there. The moment he stopped pretending. You don't get to talk to me like that, he said, his voice cold now. I felt it then. Not fear. Certainty. This was who he really was. I get to say whatever I want, I replied, because I'm not afraid of you. That was a mistake. I saw it in his eyes the second the words left my mouth. The way something dark flickered there. You should be, he said. And then it happened. It was fast. One movement. One step. One push. My foot missed the edge of the step behind me. And suddenly I was falling. The world tilted. Spun, shattered into pieces of sound and motion. The impact knocked the air out of my lungs. Pain exploding through my body as I hit the bottom of the stairs. For a second, I couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't move. Everything went silent. Then slowly, painfully, the world came back. Blurred. Distant. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, my chest rising and shallow. Uneven breaths. Kevin stood at the top of the stairs, looking down at me. Not shocked. Not panicked. Thinking. That was the worst part. He wasn't reacting. He was calculating. "What did you do?" I whispered. My voice barely there. He didn't answer. He just stood there, his expression unreadable. Seconds passed. Then something shifted in his face. Not regret. Decision. I closed my eyes slightly, forcing my body to stay still, to stay quiet. Because I understood something in that moment that I hadn't fully accepted before. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't anger. This was intent. And if I moved too soon, if I gave him a reason, he wouldn't stop. My hand twitched slightly against the floor. Pain shot through my arm. Sharp and grounding. Stay still. Stay quiet. Wait. Somewhere in the house, I heard a faint sound. The camera. The small security system we had installed months ago. Something Kevin had insisted on. He had forgotten about it. But I hadn't. And suddenly, through the pain, through the fear, through everything, I realized something. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't the only one who had seen the truth. This time, it had been recorded. I remember the sound before I remember the pain. A distant ringing, like something inside my head had cracked open and couldn't quite close again. Then the pain came in waves, sharp, dull, sharp again, pulling me back into my body whether I wanted it or not. Emily! Emily! Can you hear me? Voices. Hands. Light. I blinked slowly. The ceiling above me coming into focus in fragments. White. Too bright. Moving shadows crossing over it. I wasn't in the house anymore. I was in the ambulance. I'm here, I tried to say. But it came out weak. Barely more than a breath. Stay with me. Someone said, "You took a bad fall." A fall. That's what they were calling it. I let my eyes close for a second. Not to escape, but to think. Because I remembered the stairs. Kevin's face. The way he looked at me afterward. Not shocked. Not afraid. Just calculating. My eyes opened again. "Camera," I whispered. The paramedic leaned closer. "What?" "The camera in the house." He didn't understand. But that didn't matter. I did. And that was enough. By the time we reached the hospital, the pain had settled into something dull but constant. They moved me quickly. Questions. Scans. Hands checking. Voices overlapping. Concussion. Bruising. Nothing broken. But close. I answered what I had to, letting them work. Letting them believe what they wanted for now. Because the truth wasn't something I could say out loud yet. Not until I had proof. And I did. Or at least, I would. Hours later, when I was finally alone in the room, the door opened quietly. 2 officers stepped inside. "Emily," one of them said gently, "we need to ask you about what happened." I nodded slowly, sitting up slightly despite the pain. "I fell," I said. The words felt wrong even as they left my mouth, but not as wrong as the truth without evidence. The officer studied me for a second longer than necessary. "Can you walk us through it?" I hesitated. Then, "There's a camera," I said. Both of them paused. "In your house?" one asked. I nodded. "Living room." It would have recorded everything. A shift passed between them. This was different now. "Thank you." The other officer said, "We'll look into that immediately." Good. Because once they saw it, there would be no more questions. No more doubt. No more pretending. The hours after that passed slowly. Too slowly. Every second stretched. Filled with waiting. Waiting for them to come back. Waiting for confirmation. Waiting for the moment everything would change. When the door finally opened again, I didn't need to ask. I saw it in their faces. We reviewed the footage. One of them said. My chest tightened. And, "It shows him," the officer replied. "Kevin, pushing you." There it was. Simple, clear, undeniable. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the words settle into something real. Not fear, not shock, just confirmation. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't misunderstood. I had seen the truth. And now, so had they. What happens now? I asked. The officer exchanged a glance with his partner. We're moving forward with this as an assault case, he said. But given everything else you reported, we're expanding the investigation. Everything else. The cliff. My father. Hannah. It was all starting to connect. They left shortly after that. But the room didn't feel empty anymore. It felt different. Like something had shifted permanently. Later that day, another officer came in. This time with more questions. About Kevin. About his work. About his finances. I told them what I knew. The restaurant. The debt. The transactions I had found. I didn't give them everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough for them to start digging. And they did. Fast. By the evening, things were already changing. They found documents. Fake ones. Signatures that didn't match. Records that had been altered. The deeper they went, the worse it got. Payments linked to accounts that didn't make sense. Names that didn't belong. Patterns that pointed to something deliberate. Something planned. He was trying to move assets. One of the officers told me quietly. Connected to your father. My stomach tightened. That was it. That was the reason. Not anger. Not fear. Money. Control. And when my father got in the way, he became a problem. Everything connected now. Hannah. The baby. The files. My father. Me. We weren't separate pieces. We were part of the same plan. Or what was left of it. Is he in custody? I asked. The officer nodded. For now. For now. That was enough. I leaned back against the pillow, closing my eyes for a moment, not to escape, to breathe. Because for the first time since that night, I wasn't guessing anymore. I wasn't chasing shadows. I had something real, something solid. Proof. And Kevin, he didn't have control anymore. Not over the story. Not over the truth. Not over me. When I opened my eyes again, the room felt clearer, sharper, like everything had finally come into focus. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was steady. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. Not relief? Not yet. But something close. Because the truth wasn't hidden anymore. It was recorded. Documented. Impossible to deny. And now, it was only a matter of time. The courtroom felt colder than I expected. Not physically, though the air was sharp and dry, but in a way that settled under my skin. Everything inside that room was controlled, measured. Every word mattered. Every pause meant something. I stood just outside the doors for a moment, adjusting my grip on the folder in my hands, steadying my breath. This was it. Not the beginning. Not even the middle. The end. When I stepped inside, all eyes turned for a second before shifting away again. People always do that. They look just long enough to place you in the story, then pretend they don't want to know more. Kevin was already there, seated at the defense table, his posture straight, his expression calm. Too calm. He looked like the same man I had lived with for years. Same face, same presence. But now, I could see everything behind it, and he knew I could. For a second, his eyes met mine. No apology, no regret, just calculation. I looked away first, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't need to look at him to know who he was anymore. The proceedings began quickly. Charges were read out, one after another, each one landing heavier than the last. Assault, attempted murder, fraud-related activity. Each word stripped away another layer of the life I thought I had lived. The prosecutor stood, outlining the case with precision. This wasn't about a single moment of anger. This was a pattern, a sequence of decisions, a plan. The first piece of evidence they presented was the footage. The screen flickered to life. And suddenly, I was watching myself. The living room. The stairs. Kevin standing there. Then the push. I didn't look away. I forced myself to watch every second. The impact, the stillness, the way he stood at the top of the stairs afterward. Not shocked, not panicked, thinking. The room was silent when it ended. Not a single sound. Because there was nothing to argue, nothing to explain away. It was clear. It was real. And it was over for him. Next came the financial records. Documents projected onto the screen. Transactions. Transfers. Names that meant nothing to most people, but everything in context. The prosecutor walked the jury through each one, building the timeline piece by piece. Kevin's debts. His attempts to move money. His connection to accounts tied to my father. The motive. Clear. Calculated. Not emotional. Strategic. Then came Julia. She walked to the stand with quiet determination, her eyes flicking briefly toward me before settling forward. Her voice was steady as she spoke. About Hannah. About the fear. About the pressure. She told me she was trying to leave him, Julia said. She said he was involved in something she didn't understand, something dangerous. The courtroom shifted again. The story was getting bigger. Not just a marriage. Not just a crime. A system. A pattern. A risk. She was scared of him. Julia continued. And she said if anything happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. Those words hung in the air long after she finished. Then it was my turn. I stood slowly. The weight of every step grounded in something stronger than fear. The truth. I took the stand and faced forward. Not Kevin. Not anyone else. Just the truth. I spoke about the night at the cliff. About following him. About the box. About the sound I thought I heard before it disappeared. I spoke about my father. The hospital. The memory loss. And then the stairs. The moment everything changed. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. Every word was clear. Controlled. Final. When I finished, the room felt different. Heavier. Complete. Kevin's defense tried to shift the narrative. They called it stress. A misunderstanding. An accident. But the words didn't land. Not against the footage. Not against the records. Not against the truth. Each argument fell apart under its own weight. Contradictions exposed. Details that didn't match. Explanations that didn't hold. And slowly, piece by piece, Kevin's control disappeared. I watched it happen. The way his posture changed. The way his jaw tightened. The way his eyes lost that sharp edge they used to have. He wasn't in control anymore. Not here. Not now. When the final arguments were made, the room fell into silence again. The judge looked down at the documents in front of him, then back up. Time stretched, every second pulling tighter. Then the verdict was delivered. Guilty. The word echoed in my mind, not as a shock but as confirmation. Guilty. On all counts. There was no reaction from me at first. No tears. No release. Just stillness. Because this wasn't a moment of victory. It was a moment of ending. Kevin didn't look at me right away. When he finally did, it wasn't the same look as before. Not calculation. Not control. Something else. Something smaller. I met his gaze. And held it. For the first time since this all began, I didn't feel anything when I looked at him. Not love. Not anger. Not fear. Just distance. The sentence came next. Years. Decades. Enough time to make sure he would never walk free again. And when it was over, I stood. Not rushed. Not shaken. Just steady. As I walked out of that courtroom, the air outside felt different. Lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because something had finally stopped. That day, the truth didn't just come out. It stayed. The sunlight felt unfamiliar on my skin. I stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, letting it settle over me. Warm and steady, like something I had almost forgotten existed. People moved around me, voices, footsteps, fragments of conversations, but none of it touched me. For the first time in a long time, everything was quiet inside. Not empty, Not numb. Just quiet. I took a slow breath and walked forward. Away from the building. Away from everything that had happened inside it. Kevin was gone. Not just physically. Gone from my life in every way that mattered. And yet, nothing felt dramatic about it. No relief flooding through me. No overwhelming sense of victory. Just an ending. And the beginning of something I didn't fully understand yet. The drive to the hospital was slower than usual. I didn't rush. I didn't feel like I had to. When I stepped into my father's room, he was sitting up, a blanket draped over his legs, his eyes clearer than the last time I saw him. "Hey," I said softly. He looked up, and this time there was recognition. "Emily," he said. My chest tightened, but not with pain, with something softer. "I'm here," I replied, moving closer. He studied my face for a second, like he was piecing something together. "They told me about the trial," he said. I nodded. "It's over." He exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly. "I remember a little," he added. My heart skipped. "What do you remember?" "Not everything," he said. "Just fragments. Conversations. I found something I wasn't supposed to see." I sat down beside him, my hands resting in my lap. "What kind of something?" He hesitated. "Money," he said finally. "Movements that didn't make sense." I confronted him. I thought it was just desperation. "Kevin." "Of course." "But it wasn't," I said quietly. He shook his head. "No," he replied. "It was bigger than that." Silence settled between us. But it wasn't heavy anymore. It was understanding. He reached for my hand, his grip still weak but steady. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For not seeing it sooner," he replied. "For not protecting you." I squeezed his hand gently. "You didn't fail me," I said. "You helped me see the truth." And that was enough. When I got home later that day, the house felt different again. Not because it had changed, but because I had the same walls, the same furniture, but the weight was gone. The fear wasn't waiting in the corners anymore. It had left with him. The baby stirred softly in the bassinet as I walked into the living room. I paused for a moment, watching him. The rise and fall of his tiny chest grounding me in something real. He wasn't part of Kevin's story anymore. Not to me. He was something else. Something that deserved a future untouched by everything that came before. I lifted him carefully, holding him close, feeling the warmth of him settle against me. "You're safe?" I whispered. And for the first time, I believed it. The days that followed were quiet, simple, not perfect, but real. I returned to the classroom slowly, my students filling the space with noise and life, reminding me of something I had almost lost. Routine. Purpose. I started helping where I could, women who didn't have answers yet, who were still standing at the beginning of something they didn't understand. Because I knew what that felt like. I knew how easy it was to ignore the signs, to explain things away, to trust someone who didn't deserve it. And I knew what it took to walk away from that, one step at a time. A few weeks later, I found myself back on the mountain road. The same one. The same cliff. I parked in the same spot, stepping out into the quiet air, the wind moving gently through the trees. For a moment, I just stood there, looking down, not with fear, not with anger, but with clarity. This was where everything broke. And somehow, this was where I found myself again. I took a breath, letting it out slowly. He thought he could hide the truth here. I said softly, almost to myself. But the truth doesn't disappear. It waits. It surfaces. It finds its way back, just like I did. I turned away from the edge, walking back toward my car without looking back. Because I didn't need to anymore. The worst night of my life didn't end me. It revealed everything I needed to see. And sometimes that's what survival looks like. If you've ever had that feeling that something wasn't right, even when you couldn't prove it, listen to it. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted, know that you're not alone. And if you've ever had to rebuild your life from something you never expected to lose, I see you. Stories like this aren't just about what happened. They're about what we become after. So, if this story stayed with you, if it made you think, or reminded you of something you've been through, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you want more stories like this, stories about truth, survival, and finding strength when everything falls apart, stay with this channel. Because sometimes, the story doesn't end when everything breaks. Sometimes, that's where it finally begins. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.